Hi everyone, Alexa Rae here. As a part of the present course in personality and adjustment, I'm going to be applying course concepts to characters represented in film. The 2016 film Loving tells the story of the relationship between Richard and Mildred Loving, who are an interracial couple in the 1960s who challenged the 1967 Supreme Court to get rid of state laws prohibiting interracial marriage. Specifically, this presentation will analyze the personality of Richard Loving through the lens of course topics, including stress, coping, and environmental influence, which is often considered nature. The character Richard Loving provides a rich analysis because of the context the film provides. So we get to observe Loving in the context of significant relationships, those with his mother, his partner Mildred, and people in positions of authority over him. And we also observe him over the course of his relationship with Mildred, which provides an opportunity to analyze the consistency of the topics listed here. I'm also interested to consider the intersection between these personality concepts and the larger context of marginalization and racial identity, given Richard Loving is a white man navigating racialization through his voluntary, although romantic, relationship with Mildred. This is significantly different than Mildred's experience of racialization as a woman of color who doesn't have the opportunity to simply opt out of her experience. We first meet Richard in the film in what appears to be his early or mid-20s, in the exciting youth of his relationship with Mildred. Even in the most joyous moments of the film, Richard is reserved and taciturn, barely speaking any words. He is observed to be hardworking, often performing physical labor and working with his hands. And we also see him relating to Mildred with a gentle and kind demeanor. The dominant characteristic performed throughout this film is that of devotion to his wife from beginning to end. The first topic we'll consider in the personality analysis of Richard is stress. And it's important to get a sense for what we mean by this sort of ubiquitous term. We hear about stress everywhere. Larson and Buss define stress by two elements. Firstly, in the sense that it overwhelms our capacity, and then secondly, in the sense that any given situation might be outside of our control. They also characterize stress by ambivalence, where we have the simultaneous urge to avoid the situation and to overcome the situation. We know this tendency to avoid can be pathological. When stress is overwhelming, it can create disorders of mood, anxiety, and impulse control, all of which are characterized by emotional avoidance of difficult or unwanted emotions. In the case of Richard Loving, such a pathological development would have had historical significance. If he had been exposed to stress and then as a result experienced chronic avoidance, we would likely not have seen the outcome in the 1967 Supreme Court case that the film centers around. We first see Richard's response to a stressor really early in the film, when Mildred tells him that she's pregnant. His reaction is purely enthusiasm and commitment. We don't see any signs of overwhelm or even concern. It appears that his experience of stress is mitigated by the strength of his attachment to Mildred, and also his capacity to imagine an internal locus of control. This is a term to describe the belief that an individual can influence events around them rather than external forces. And we see this in his investment in property and goal to build a home following hearing about the pregnancy. As the film progresses, we see stressors push beyond Richard's control. When he and Mildred are jailed after police enter the home of Mildred's family where they are sleeping. And still, the strength of his attachment seems to motivate him to persevere rather than avoid. He immediately begins to advocate rather than shrink back or abandon the relationship. Finally, toward the end of the film, we see more evidence of the impact of stress on Richard. We see much more negative and withdrawn affect, He starts to express more distrust for the legal advocates working with him, and he declines to be physically present in the court itself. The cinematic representation of Richard demonstrates Hans Selye's 1967 general adaptation syndrome, except that it applies over the course of a lifetime, where Richard moves through stages of alarm, resistance, and then eventually exhaustion. This is reflective of the wider exploration of chronic stress currently being conducted by such medical thinkers as Gabor Mate in his book, When the Body Says No. Given the present-day reality of chronic stress that are caused by related sources like marginalization and economic disadvantage, research on stress and personality over the course of a lifetime is incredibly relevant. The second topic we will discuss is coping and the strategies and styles that predict outcomes. Larson and Buss point to attributional style as a predictor of functional coping. Attributional style describes what factors we attribute events in our lives to on 3 different axes. Firstly, internal versus external. Do I believe I caused this, or did external forces cause this? Secondly, stable versus unstable. Will these factors always cause these events? And finally, specific versus global. Is this just about me? Researchers Scheer and Carver developed the concept of dispositional optimism to describe the basic sense that good things will happen often and bad things will be rare. While Richard never articulates the meaning he is making of the stressors he and his family are exposed to, we can suppose a certain attribution style based on his behaviors. In the beginning of the film, we see him and Mildred drive to Washington, D.C. to become married, knowing their marriage is not going to be allowed in the state of Virginia. This simple act of driving to D.C. demonstrates dispositional optimism, or the assumption that everything's going to work out, in spite of much evidence to the contrary. After he is released from jail, while Mildred remains incarcerated, he returns to advocate for her release, demonstrating a strong sense of personal agency or internal attribution. He believes he can make change happen. A potential area for research here is to consider the impact of marginalization, in this case systemic racism, and how it impacts the development of attributional style. If I'm a person who experiences power and privilege because of my race, I am more likely to believe that I am in control and that good things will happen. If I'm a person who experiences discrimination based on these same factors through my life, I may be more likely to develop a negative attributional style because of a lifetime experiences confirming that many negative events are outside of my control and are deeply personal. Furthermore, I may also witness my primary caregivers as being affected by discrimination and potentially modeling a negative attributional style. Many of these questions are being explored in research on intergenerational trauma, and personality psychology has an opportunity to provide a compelling context for future research. As the movie goes on and we witness the exhaustion of Richard's emotional resources, we see greater agency and engagement in Mildred. A second opportunity for research here is to consider resiliency and the longevity of attributional style when exposed to chronic stress, as in the case of Richard, versus the longevity of attributional style when facing intergenerational systemic discrimination, as in the case of Mildred. Much more research is required to understand the development of coping strategies and their intersection with identity-based marginalization. These considerations lead nicely into our third topic, nurture and the environment. Larson and Buss define environmentally as the degree to which something like a characteristic can be attributed to environmental factors or genetics. Essentially, it's the nature versus nurture debate. As an audience, we can only speculate on the sources of Richard's personality structure, his experience of stress, and his coping style. We know his passion for racial justice was shared by his father. Although we never meet his father, we hear an anecdote that he had worked for a person of color. Whether this sense for social justice and equality was based on genetic commonality or behavioral modeling, we don't know. We can't know. But what personality psychology tells us is that it's very likely an interaction between the two. Through genetic studies, we know that nature and nurture interact with each other. The term reactive genotype environment correlation describes the response of our particular genotypes that our particular genotypes elicit from our environments. So the example that Larson and Buss provide is that of a cuddly and very social child who will reach out for interaction, and then as a product of this have a childhood full of interaction, and then will likely be a more social adult or young person. Whereas a child who's less social or less cuddly will have less opportunities to interact and may then be less interactive as they grow up. So their personality is interacting with their environment. Richard's identity as a white man also creates a particular environment for him, a reactive genotype environment correlation, because the world that he lives in as a white man is significantly different than the world that Mildred lives in as a woman of color. They might actually be occupying the same physical space, but while both Richard and Mildred are experiencing the same stressor, Richard has a lifetime of experiences of being responded to as a white man, and he continues to be responded to in this way. And we see this in his ability to occupy space in conversation with other people of power and authority, and also the way that harm against him is easily recognized, whereas harm against marginalized groups is less easily recognized by dominant culture. In addition, while both Richard and Mildred are facing marginalization, Richard's experience is voluntary. He at any time has the opportunity to abandon the work of advocacy and to reclaim the power he has in society, while Mildred cannot. And even though he never uses it, the simple power he has to leave the situation likely has a large influence on his sense of control and his stress and coping. Again, the question of environmental force of discrimination and its impact on stress and coping returns. The 2016 film Loving provides a great opportunity to consider elements of personality over the course of a lifetime. And then, the broader context of systemic racism and oppression brings many questions to the field of personality psychology. So a concept as simple as attributional style becomes really complex when we imagine the many different histories that people are exposed to. When we look at elements of personality and then pathologize different responses without considering these histories or environmental influences, we're missing a huge piece of the picture. And this becomes even more problematic when these models have power. So one instance where these models have enormous power is in psychiatry, in the medical model for personality disorders. And when those models have power and we don't consider forces like transphobia, racism, gender-based discrimination, and the influence they have on the development of personality structure, then we're turning around and telling individuals who have been marginalized that they are unwell. So we're adding insult to injury. Not only do individuals experience discrimination, but the personality structures that develop in response are also discriminated against. So personality psychology has huge opportunity here to expand the idea of trauma-informed perspectives to perspectives that are also informed by systemic oppression. My reference for the presentation are listed here, and any of my unmarked images are sourced by Unsplash. Thank you.